What if every moment of your life, every embarrassing mistake, every broken promise, every time you chose comfort over courage, was destined to repeat forever? Picture this. That cringy thing you said 3 years ago that still makes you wince, you'll say it again. That moment when you walked past someone who needed help because you were in a hurry? Eternal repetition. The time you stayed silent when you should have spoken up. The conversation you avoided, the risk you didn't take. All of it cycling endlessly through infinite time without the slightest possibility of change or escape. This isn't some feel-good spiritual concept about learning lessons through multiple lifetimes. This is Friedrich Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, one of the most psychologically brutal ideas ever conceived by human intelligence. Nietzsche didn't present this as comforting metaphysical theory. He presented it as the ultimate psychological test. If you discovered that your exact life, down to every mundane detail and fleeting thought, would repeat infinite times, would that knowledge crush you with despair or fill you with overwhelming joy? Consider what this means for this precise moment. You reading these words, whatever you're thinking right now, whatever emotions you're feeling, according to eternal recurrence, this configuration has already happened infinite times and will happen infinite times more. That anxiety you're carrying about tomorrow, infinite repetition. The way you treated your family this morning, forever. That pattern of procrastination you keep promising to break, eternally unchanged, cycling through cosmic repetition without end. Here's what makes this idea truly devastating. Nietzsche believed that most people, if they honestly confronted eternal recurrence, would experience it as the ultimate horror. The thought of living their actual lives, not idealized fantasy versions, but their real existence with all its mediocrity, compromise, and unfulfilled potential, infinite times would psychologically destroy them. But he also believed this same idea could transform certain individuals into something beyond ordinary human limitations, into what he called the Übermensch, someone who could love their fate so completely they would choose to repeat it forever. Today we're exploring a philosophical concept so psychologically intense that even its creator struggled with its implications. This isn't academic philosophy. It's a direct confrontation with the most fundamental question of existence. Do you love your life enough to live it infinite times exactly as it is? And what does your honest answer reveal about how you're actually choosing to spend your days? Imagine you're lying in bed at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, wrestling with the accumulated weight of another day's small compromises and missed opportunities. The job that drains your soul, the relationships you've let drift through inattention, the creative projects you keep postponing until someday. In this moment of brutal honesty with yourself, a figure appears, not offering you anything, but delivering a cosmic verdict that changes everything. This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, the figure announces. There will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh must come back to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. This is Nietzsche's famous thought experiment from The Gay Science, but notice how he structured it. This isn't a philosophical debate about whether eternal recurrence is metaphysically true. It's a psychological stress test designed to reveal your deepest relationship with your own existence. The question isn't whether you believe this will literally happen. The question is whether you could psychologically survive even contemplating it. Think about your immediate emotional response to this idea. Does the thought of infinite repetition fill you with dread or delight? Most people's first reaction is a kind of existential panic, the desperate need to escape, to change something, to ensure this exact life doesn't continue forever. But Nietzsche designed the thought experiment to be inescapable. Everything exactly the same, including your knowledge of the repetition, including this very moment of realization. What makes this so psychologically effective is how it strips away all the comforting illusions we use to tolerate unsatisfying lives. We tell ourselves we'll change tomorrow, next year, when we get a better job, when we find the right relationship, when circumstances improve. But eternal recurrence eliminates all possibility of future redemption. This life, these choices, these patterns of behavior, this is it, repeating infinitely without variation. Consider how this reframes every decision you make. That snide comment you're about to make, you'll make it infinite times. That moment of genuine kindness you're considering, eternal repetition. The choice to spend another evening scrolling mindlessly through social media instead of creating something meaningful, forever and ever, exactly the same, world without end. Suddenly, every action becomes cosmically significant because every action is all actions. But here's what Nietzsche understood about human psychology. Most people live their entire lives in flight from exactly this kind of ultimate responsibility. We prefer to think of ourselves as victims of circumstances, products of our environment, shaped by forces beyond our control. Eternal recurrence ruthlessly eliminates these escape routes by making clear that how you respond to any situation is entirely your choice, and you'll have to live with that choice forever. The genius of this thought experiment is that it reveals the difference between the life you're actually living and the life you tell yourself you're living. If the prospect of infinite repetition horrifies you, that horror is telling you something crucial about patterns you've been tolerating, compromises you've been making, or authenticity you've been sacrificing. Your response to eternal recurrence is a perfect diagnostic test for your relationship with your own existence. But here's where eternal recurrence becomes truly psychologically disturbing. It transforms every seemingly insignificant moment into something of infinite consequence. Under ordinary circumstances, we treat most of our daily interactions as disposable, temporary encounters that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But if every moment repeats forever, there are no throwaway encounters, no insignificant choices, no interactions too small to carry eternal weight. That dismissive look you gave the barista this morning, you'll give it infinite times. The patience you showed to someone who was struggling, eternally repeated. The truth you chose not to speak because it would be uncomfortable, forever unsaid, across infinite cycles of cosmic repetition. Every micro-expression, every tone of voice, every moment of presence or distraction becomes a permanent feature of reality that you personally authored. Recent research on what psychologists call micro-moments reveals something that would have fascinated Nietzsche. A 2019 study published in Psychological Science found that brief positive interactions with strangers, exchanges lasting just seconds, had measurable effects on mood and well-being that persisted for hours. But under eternal recurrence, these micro-moments don't just affect you for hours, they affect you forever, because they constitute the texture of your infinite experience. Think about the people who've shaped your life most profoundly. How many of them influenced you through grand dramatic gestures versus consistent patterns of small interactions? How many of your most meaningful memories involve someone simply being fully present with you during an ordinary moment? Eternal recurrence makes every one of these moments cosmically significant because each one will be experienced infinite times. Consider your relationship patterns through this lens. The way you handle conflict with people you love, the level of honesty you bring to intimate conversations, the quality of attention you offer when someone needs to be heard. Under eternal recurrence, these aren't just personality quirks or temporary states. They're eternal patterns that define who you are across infinite cycles of existence. This transforms how you think about forgiveness in revolutionary ways. If someone hurt you, and that hurt is going to repeat eternally, does holding on to resentment serve any purpose other than ensuring you experience that resentment infinite times? Conversely, if you've hurt someone and that harm is eternal, does anything short of genuine transformation make sense? Eternal recurrence eliminates the possibility of getting over anything. You have to find ways to love even the painful parts of your history. A particularly striking 2020 study from Harvard examined what researchers called presence quality in close relationships. They found that people could immediately distinguish between partners who were physically present but mentally elsewhere versus those who were genuinely engaged, and that this distinction had profound effects on relationship satisfaction over time. Under eternal recurrence, every moment you're physically present but mentally absent becomes an infinite missed opportunity for authentic connection. But the most challenging application of this principle is to your relationship with yourself. How do you talk to yourself when you make mistakes? How do you treat your body when you're tired or stressed? How present are you to your own emotional experiences versus rushing through them to get to the next thing? If these self-relationship patterns were eternal, would you choose more compassion or more criticism, more presence or more avoidance? Research by Kristen Neff on self-compassion takes on disturbing new meaning when viewed through eternal recurrence. Her studies consistently show that people who treat themselves with kindness demonstrate better emotional regulation and greater resilience than those who rely on self-criticism. But eternal recurrence makes self-compassion not just psychologically beneficial, but existentially necessary. You're going to be living with yourself forever, literally, so you might as well learn to enjoy your own company. Have you ever noticed how differently you behave when you think nobody is watching versus when you know someone important is observing? Eternal recurrence eliminates this distinction entirely because you are always watching yourself, infinite future versions, experiencing every choice you make right now. Now, here's where eternal recurrence reveals its true psychological genius and its genuine danger. The same idea that could liberate you from inauthenticity could also drive you into the deepest despair imaginable. Nietzsche understood that eternal recurrence was essentially a psychological fork in the road. It would either transform you into something superhuman or destroy you completely. There is no middle ground when confronting infinity. Consider what happens when someone first seriously contemplates eternal recurrence and realizes they genuinely cannot bear the thought of living their life infinite times. The immediate response is often crushing nihilism. If this is all there is, if nothing ever changes, if every mistake is permanent and every missed opportunity eternal, then what's the point of trying? Why attempt to improve if improvement is impossible? Why care about anything if everything just repeats mindlessly forever without progress or redemption? This nihilistic response represents learned helplessness taken to its cosmic extreme. When laboratory animals are subjected to inescapable negative stimuli, they often stop trying to escape, even when escape becomes possible. They generalize from powerlessness to assume all situations are hopeless. Eternal recurrence can trigger this same psychological mechanism in humans, the crushing realization that if nothing can ever truly change because everything is locked into infinite repetition, then agency itself becomes meaningless. But Nietzsche saw this nihilistic response as a failure of psychological courage, not an inevitable conclusion. He believed that individuals with sufficient inner strength would respond to eternal recurrence not with despair, but with what he called amor fati, love of fate. Not mere acceptance or resignation, but active, passionate embrace of existence in all its pain and glory. "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati," he wrote. "That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity." Think about what this really means psychologically. Amor fati isn't about being satisfied with mediocrity or accepting injustice passively. It's about loving your life so completely, including your struggles, failures, and moments of suffering, that you would actively choose to live it exactly as it happened, infinite times. It's about finding your existence so fundamentally meaningful that eternal repetition feels like infinite gift rather than infinite punishment. Recent research in positive psychology has inadvertently validated aspects of Nietzsche's insight about amor fati. Studies on psychological resilience consistently find that people who can find meaning in suffering, who can integrate difficult experiences into coherent life narratives, show dramatically better mental health outcomes than those who resist or deny painful realities. A 2021 meta-analysis published in Clinical Psychology Review found that radical acceptance, the ability to embrace difficult emotions without trying to change them, was one of the strongest predictors of psychological well-being across diverse populations. But eternal recurrence demands something far more challenging than ordinary acceptance practices. It's not just about accepting what happened in the past or what's happening now. It's about loving your life so completely that you choose to experience every moment of suffering infinite times, because it's inseparable from the totality of who you are. Consider Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, and developed his theory of meaning-making based on those experiences. Frankl observed that prisoners who could find purpose in their suffering were far more likely to survive than those who couldn't. But eternal recurrence asks something even more radical. Could you love your worst experiences so completely that you choose to repeat them forever? Not because you're masochistic, but because they're integral to who you became, and you love who you became enough to accept everything that created you. This is where eternal recurrence becomes a test of what Nietzsche called psychological strength. Psychologically weak individuals, faced with the idea of infinite repetition, either fall into nihilistic despair or engage in fantasy about how they would live differently if given another chance. Psychologically strong individuals recognize that eternal recurrence eliminates all possibility of another chance and forces them to love this chance so completely that they need no other. Ask yourself honestly, if you discovered tomorrow that eternal recurrence was literally true, would your first impulse be to despair about being trapped in your current existence, or to feel grateful that you get to experience it infinite times? Your immediate emotional response reveals something profound about your relationship with your own life. So, how do you actually live with the psychological weight of eternal recurrence? Nietzsche didn't leave this as abstract philosophy. He provided what amounts to practical guidance for inhabiting a life you'd be willing to repeat forever. The key insight is that eternal recurrence isn't about changing your external circumstances to make them more acceptable. It's about developing the inner capacity to love your circumstances so completely that external validation becomes irrelevant. Start with immediate, concrete application. Tonight, before you sleep, review every significant interaction you had today. Every conversation, every moment of patience or irritation, every choice to be present or distracted, every decision to speak truthfully or hold back. Now ask yourself, if I knew I would repeat this exact day infinite times, which moments would fill me with joy at the prospect of eternal repetition, and which would make me want to hide from infinity? The psychological impact of this exercise is immediate and often overwhelming. Most people discover they're living far below their own standards for what constitutes a life worth repeating infinitely. They realize they're tolerating patterns of behavior, both from themselves and others, that they would find unbearable if they had to experience them forever. But here's the crucial insight. This recognition doesn't lead to despair if you approach it correctly. It leads to what psychologists call values clarification. Suddenly you know exactly what matters most, because you can feel it viscerally when you imagine repeating different experiences forever. Research on mortality salience, exercises that force people to confront their own death, reveals something fascinating. A 2020 study from UC Berkeley found that people who regularly contemplated mortality made decisions more aligned with their stated values, showed increased authenticity in relationships, and reported greater life satisfaction. But eternal recurrence creates the opposite psychological pressure with similar results. Instead of urgency from limited time, it creates weight from infinite time. Consider your career through this lens. If you knew you'd repeat your current work life infinite times, every meeting, every email, every moment of engagement or boredom, would you feel grateful or horrified? This isn't about finding your dream job or achieving some fantasy of perfect work. It's about whether you can find enough meaning in your current professional reality that infinite repetition feels like abundance rather than torture. Think about your relationships using the same framework, the way you and your loved ones handle conflict, the conversations you have and avoid, the level of honesty and vulnerability you bring to intimate connections. Could you love these patterns enough to repeat them forever? Not because they're perfect, but because they're genuinely reflective of who you choose to be with other people. But here's where eternal recurrence becomes truly radical. It reveals that the desire to change your circumstances often masks unwillingness to take full responsibility for your current experience. Most people think, if only I had a better job, relationship, living situation, then I could be happy. But eternal recurrence asks, can you find happiness so profound in this job, relationship, living situation that you choose to experience it infinite times? This creates what we might call the acceptance paradox. When you stop trying to escape your current reality and instead focus on loving it completely, you often discover that your external circumstances begin shifting naturally. Not because you're manipulating them, but because your relationship to them has changed so fundamentally that you make different choices. Research on psychological acceptance consistently shows that people who can embrace difficult emotions without trying to change them often experience more positive change than those who fight against their circumstances. The most challenging aspect of eternal recurrence practice is applying it to your most painful experiences. Can you love your history of mistakes, failures, and suffering enough that you choose to repeat them infinitely? Not because you enjoy pain, but because you recognize these experiences were necessary for creating whoever you've become, and you love who you've become enough to accept everything that made you possible. Apply this to your daily self-talk. How do you respond to yourself when you make mistakes? How do you treat your own emotional needs when they're inconvenient? If you knew you'd repeat these internal relationship patterns infinite times, would you choose more self-compassion or more self-criticism? More presence to your own experience or more rushing toward the next distraction? Ask yourself right now, if you discovered that eternal recurrence was literally true, what would you change about tomorrow? Not eventually, not when you get around to it, but tomorrow. And then ask the deeper question. What's preventing you from making those changes anyway, regardless of whether eternal recurrence is true? But here's where eternal recurrence reveals its most revolutionary implications. Nietzsche saw it not just as a test of psychological acceptance, but as the forge that could transform ordinary humans into something beyond conventional limitations. The person who could not only accept, but actively love the idea of eternal recurrence would become what he called the Übermensch, someone who had transcended the psychological constraints that keep most people trapped in resentment, mediocrity, and dependence on external validation. This transformation requires confronting a terrifying realization. If eternal recurrence eliminates all external justification for your choices because everything just repeats meaninglessly forever, then you must become your own source of meaning. The values you live by, the purposes you pursue, the relationships you invest in, none of these can be justified by appeals to God, society, tradition, or any authority outside yourself, because you'll have to live with your choices infinite times, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Think about the areas of your life where you're still seeking external validation, the career achievements you want because they'll impress others, the lifestyle choices you make to fit in or stand out, the opinions you hold because they're socially acceptable rather than because you've genuinely thought them through. Under eternal recurrence, all external validation becomes meaningless, because the only perspective that matters across infinite repetition is your own relationship to your choices. This is what Nietzsche meant by becoming who you are, not discovering some pre-existing authentic self, but actively creating yourself through your choices, and then loving that creation so completely that you choose to repeat the process forever. The Übermensch isn't someone born with special abilities. It's someone who has developed the psychological strength to be their own ultimate authority on what makes life worth living. Recent research on intrinsic motivation inadvertently validates aspects of this approach. Studies consistently show that people who pursue goals for their own inherent value rather than external rewards report higher life satisfaction and better mental health. A comprehensive 2019 meta-analysis found that intrinsically motivated individuals were more resilient to setbacks, more creative in problem-solving, and more likely to maintain effort over time. But eternal recurrence demands something more radical than pursuing intrinsic motivation. It requires developing what we might call existential sovereignty. Existential sovereignty means the ability to create meaning that's so personally authentic and psychologically satisfying that it needs no validation from anything outside yourself. Not because you're arrogant or disconnected from others, but because you've developed such profound self-knowledge that you can distinguish between what you genuinely value and what you think you should value. Consider what this looks like in practice. Most people choose careers, relationships, and lifestyles based partly on what they actually want, and partly on what they think will earn approval from parents, peers, or society. But someone with existential sovereignty makes choices based purely on what they can love deeply enough to repeat forever. They're not trying to impress anyone or prove anything. They're simply creating a life that feels so fundamentally right that infinite repetition seems like blessing rather than curse. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or ignoring others' needs. In fact, research shows that people with strong intrinsic motivation are often more generous and altruistic than those motivated primarily by external rewards. But it means your generosity flows from genuine care rather than obligation. Your relationships are chosen rather than endured, and your work serves purposes you've consciously embraced rather than goals you've unconsciously inherited. The most challenging aspect of developing existential sovereignty is confronting the terrifying freedom to create your own values in a universe that provides no ultimate guidance. Most people flee from this freedom into what existentialists call bad faith, pretending they have no choice, that their values are determined by circumstances, that they're victims of forces beyond their control. The Übermensch embraces this freedom completely, understanding that the capacity to create meaning is actually the most powerful ability humans possess. Think about someone like Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison and emerged without bitterness, having transformed both himself and his understanding of justice through decades of reflection. Mandela didn't just survive imprisonment, he used it to develop a vision of reconciliation that he loved deeply enough that he probably would have chosen the entire experience, including the suffering, if he knew it would create that capacity for forgiveness and leadership. This is the Übermensch possibility within eternal recurrence. Not becoming superhuman in some fantasy sense, but developing the psychological strength to love your life, including its necessary difficulties, so completely that you would choose to create it exactly as it happened, infinite times, because you love who it made you become. So, how do you actually test whether you're developing this capacity for loving your fate? Nietzsche provided what amounts to a daily psychological practice that's both simple to understand and transformative to implement. The practice is deceptively straightforward. Live each day as if you knew with absolute certainty that you would repeat it exactly the same way infinite times. This isn't about perfectionism or trying to live some impossible ideal. It's about bringing conscious awareness to choices you usually make automatically. Before you speak dismissively to someone, pause and ask, could I love making this comment infinite times? Before you avoid a difficult conversation, consider, could I love this avoidance enough to repeat it forever? Before you choose distraction over presence, ask yourself, is this how I want to spend infinity? The psychological impact is immediate and often shocking. Most people discover they're making dozens of choices daily that they couldn't bear to repeat forever. They realize they're tolerating patterns of behavior that violate their deepest values, simply because they've never seriously considered the cumulative weight of those patterns over time. Start with something concrete tonight. Review every significant choice you made today. Not just major decisions, but how you responded to frustration, how present you were during conversations, how you treated your own needs and limitations. For each choice, ask yourself, if I knew I would make this exact choice infinite times, would that fill me with joy or dread? This exercise reveals something crucial. Most people are living far below their own standards for what constitutes a meaningful existence. They're accepting compromises in their relationships, work, and daily habits that they would find unbearable if they truly believed those compromises were permanent. But the beautiful paradox is that this recognition doesn't lead to despair. It leads to clarity about what actually matters most to you. Consider your work life through this lens. If you knew you'd repeat every workday infinite times, every meeting, every email, every moment of boredom or engagement, would you feel grateful or trapped? This isn't about finding perfect work, but about whether you can bring enough meaning and presence to your current work that infinite repetition feels like abundance rather than punishment. Apply the same framework to your closest relationships. The way you handle conflict, the conversations you have and avoid, the level of honesty and vulnerability you bring to intimate connections. Could you love these patterns enough to repeat them forever? Not because they're perfect, but because they're authentic expressions of who you choose to be with other people. But here's the most challenging application: your relationship with your own suffering. Can you love your history of mistakes, failures, and pain enough that you choose to repeat them infinitely? Not because you enjoy suffering, but because you recognize these experiences were necessary for creating whoever you've become, and you love who you've become enough to accept everything that made you possible. The research on post-traumatic growth becomes particularly relevant here. Studies consistently show that people who experience severe trauma often report that while they wouldn't choose to repeat the experience, they also wouldn't undo it because of who they became through surviving it. They developed capacities for resilience, compassion, and meaning-making they didn't know they possessed. Under eternal recurrence, this paradox becomes the key to psychological freedom. Loving who you became enough to love everything that made you possible. A particularly powerful exercise is applying eternal recurrence to your daily self-talk. How do you respond to yourself when you make mistakes? How do you treat your own emotional needs? How present are you to your own experience versus rushing toward the next distraction? If these internal patterns were eternal, would you choose more self-compassion or more self-criticism? More presence or more avoidance? Ask yourself right now, what's one pattern in your current life that you realize you couldn't love enough to repeat eternally? And what's the smallest change you could make tomorrow that would move you toward a life you could genuinely choose to live infinite times? Not a perfect life, but a life that feels so fundamentally right that eternal repetition seems like blessing rather than curse. As we reach the end of this journey through Nietzsche's most psychologically intense idea, we arrive at a profound realization. Eternal recurrence isn't really about time, repetition, or metaphysical speculation. It's about presence. It's about developing the capacity to love this moment, this exact configuration of circumstances, emotions, and possibilities, so completely that infinite repetition feels like infinite gift rather than infinite burden. The genius of eternal recurrence as a thought experiment is that it eliminates all the psychological escape routes we usually use to avoid taking full responsibility for our current experience. You can't wait for better circumstances because these are the only circumstances you get, repeated forever. You can't hope that time will heal old wounds because there is no linear time in eternal recurrence. Only this moment, this choice, this response, cycling infinitely. But this apparent limitation is actually the source of ultimate liberation. When you truly accept that you must create meaning from whatever circumstances you face right now, you discover that you have far more power than you realized. Not power over external events, those will always be partly beyond your control, but power over the most important thing: how you choose to experience what happens to you. Think about the people throughout history who seem to embody this principle intuitively. Marcus Aurelius, writing his Meditations while managing a plague-ridden empire, finding profound meaning in doing his duty regardless of circumstances. Anne Frank, discovering beauty and hope while hiding from genocide, creating art and insight that would inspire millions. Viktor Frankl, developing his theory of meaning-making in concentration camps, understanding that the capacity to choose your attitude is the one freedom that can never be taken away. These weren't people with perfect lives. They were people who developed the psychological strength to create meaning from whatever life presented them. Under eternal recurrence, this capacity becomes the most important skill imaginable because you'll be exercising it infinite times. Consider what changes in your daily experience when you truly embrace this perspective. Every moment of genuine presence becomes infinitely precious because you get to experience it infinite times. Every act of authentic kindness creates permanent beauty in the universe. Every choice for courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over fear, becomes an eternal feature of reality that you personally authored. But the shadow side is equally important. Every moment of cruelty, cowardice, or indifference also becomes eternal. Every time you choose distraction over presence, conformity over authenticity, resentment over forgiveness, you're creating permanent features of your infinite experience. This isn't meant to create paralysis, but clarity. Suddenly you know exactly what matters because you can feel the weight of infinity in every choice. The practical implications are immediate and concrete. If you can't bear the thought of repeating your current daily patterns infinite times, those patterns are telling you something crucial about your relationship with yourself and your values. If there are relationships in your life that you couldn't love enough to experience eternally, those relationships need attention, boundaries, or transformation. If there are aspects of your routine that would horrify you if repeated forever, maybe it's time to question why you're accepting them temporarily. But here's the ultimate insight. The question isn't whether you'll actually live your life infinite times. The question is whether you love it enough that you would choose to, if given the option. And your honest answer to that question reveals everything about whether you're truly living or just passing time until something better comes along. What would change in your behavior today if you truly believed every choice you make echoes through eternity? How would you treat the people you encounter if you knew those interactions would repeat forever? What would you create, express, or pursue if you knew it would become a permanent part of reality? How would you respond to setbacks if you knew they were inseparable from your infinite story? Here's my challenge. For the next week, live each day as if you knew you would repeat it exactly, infinite times. Don't try to be perfect. Just be conscious. Notice what this awareness does to your decision-making, your presence, your treatment of others, and yourself. Pay attention to which moments make you grateful for eternal repetition and which make you want to escape from infinity. Share your discoveries. What did you learn about yourself when you imagine repeating your life infinite times? Which aspects of your daily experience would you genuinely love to repeat forever? And which revealed patterns you hadn't noticed before? How did thinking about eternal recurrence change your choices, even temporarily? Most importantly, what's one thing about your current life that you realize you love enough to repeat eternally? And what's one pattern you'd want to transform before infinity begins? Eternal recurrence isn't Nietzsche's strangest philosophical idea. It's his most practical, because the question isn't whether cosmic repetition is literally true. The question is whether you're living in a way that you could love enough to choose infinite times. Your answer reveals everything about the distance between the life you're actually living and the life that's actually worth living. The eternal hourglass turns constantly. The sand that falls through it is made of moments like this one. The only question is whether you're ready to love what falls through it so completely that you choose to experience it forever.